In the high timber country of northern Idaho, in the summer of 1951, neighbors saw Arthur Jensen building a wall on his roof. Not a chimney, a low, solid wall, 18 inches high, boxing in the entire perimeter of his new cabin's nearly flat roof. It looked like a tray. It looked like a mistake. In a land where snow was measured in feet, not inches, every man, woman, and child knew the one sacred rule of building. A roof must be steep. Steep to shed the snow. Otherwise, the weight would crush you in your sleep. People riding past on the county road would slow their trucks. They'd stare. They'd shake their heads. They thought the quiet Norwegian mill worker had finally lost his mind. They started calling it Jensen's Folly, or more grimly, the Snow Trap. And when the winter of 1952 hit with a fury that would be spoken of for generations, that crazy snow trap would prove the difference between survival and surrender. The difference between shivering desperation and quiet, steady warmth. If you want to hear the number that made the most respected builder in the valley go silent, stay until the end. What did this quiet outsider, this former shipwright, understand about snow and weight that every experienced builder in Idaho had missed for 100 years? If you're new here, subscribe for more stories of quiet competence, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Arthur Jensen wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 48-year-old man trying to keep his family from freezing. He was a former shipwright from Bergen, Norway. A man whose hands understood the language of wood under immense, relentless pressure. He'd spent 20 years building and repairing the wooden hulls of fishing trawlers that fought the North Atlantic. He understood stress, shear, and load distribution, not as theories in a book, but as forces that tried to tear a ship apart in a winter gale. In 1949, he had brought his wife, Elspeth, and their two small children, Anders and Ingrid, to the Idaho Panhandle. He'd found work at the Croft Lumber Mill, and with his savings, he bought a small plot of land with a cabin already on it. By frontier standards, it was more than respectable. It was a solid, traditional cabin with chinked log walls and a steeply pitched cedar shake roof. It was a perfect example of what everyone in the valley believed was the right way to build. Then came their first winter, the winter of 1950. It was a brutal lesson. The snow started in November and didn't stop. By January, 4 feet lay on the level ground, and the drifts were twice that high. The steep roof on their cabin did its job, mostly. It shed the snow, but it shed the snow in terrifying, unpredictable avalanches. A thundering roar would wake them in the night as a half-ton of packed snow and ice crashed to the ground. Twice, it buried their only door, and Arthur had to spend the morning digging them out. He watched a neighbor's porch get ripped clean off its foundation by a roof slide. The work was constant. After every heavy storm, Arthur was on the roof with a long-handled rake, pulling down the heavy, clinging snow before it could turn to ice and form a dam. It was dangerous, exhausting work, perched on a slippery roof in the freezing wind. But the cold was the worst part. The cabin was never truly warm. The big, open space under the pitched roof was a cavern of frigid air. The wind, howling across the wide, angled surfaces, stripped heat from the cabin relentlessly. Wind doesn't just chill air. It strips heat directly from walls. A 30-mile-per-hour wind could pull warmth through a log wall as if it were cheesecloth. Arthur burned through cord after cord of pine and fir. He fed the stove every few hours, day and night. Still, the cabin hovered in the low 50s. His children, Anders and Ingrid, slept in their coats and hats. Elspeth stuffed rags along the baseboards every evening, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. Condensation would freeze into a fine lacework of ice on the inside of the windows. This wasn't living. It was a siege. One morning in February, Arthur stood outside watching the thin plume of smoke tear away from his chimney in the wind. He looked at the massive banks of snow his roof had shed. Mountains of it he had to shovel away from his foundation. He looked at the snow lying deep and still in the forest, a thick, quiet blanket. And that's when the thought took hold. A thought that came from his time on the cold sea. On a ship, you couldn't shed the ocean. You had to build a hull strong enough to hold it back. You worked with the pressure. You didn't try to make it go away. He looked at the snow again. Everyone saw it as a weight, a threat, a crushing force to be shed at all costs. But Arthur, the shipwright, started to see it differently. Snow, especially snow with a lot of air trapped in it, was one of the best insulators on the planet. A foot of fresh, unpacked snow had an R value of around 10. 4 feet of it would be like adding a thick, seamless blanket of the best insulation money could buy to your roof. A blanket that was delivered for free. The problem wasn't the snow. The problem was the design. The community was obsessed with getting the snow off their roofs. Arthur realized the true challenge was engineering a roof that could safely hold it on. His plan was simple in concept. He would not build a roof to shed the load. He would build a deck to carry it. He would build it like the deck of a ship designed for the icy waters of the North Sea. He would build a roof that welcomed the snow, that used its weight as a shield against the cold. He spent that spring clearing a new patch of land, not far from the old cabin. He would use the old one as a workshop and a shed. He told Elspeth they were building a new home, one that would be warm. She saw the look in his eye, the quiet confidence of a master craftsman, and she trusted him. She didn't yet know how strange it would look. The opportunity came in June. The mill was selling off a surplus of heavy 8x8 and 6x6 Douglas fir beams. They were shorter lengths, less desirable for conventional framing. Arthur bought a massive pile of them for $75. The build began. The foundation and walls were standard log construction, which Arthur did with meticulous care. He was a familiar sight in the valley, a quiet, steady man who kept to himself. But when he started on the roof, the neighbors started to stare. Instead of long rafters rising to a central peak, Arthur laid his massive 8x8 beams across the shortest span of the cabin, just 12 feet, and he placed them incredibly close together, only 16 inches on center. A conventional roof might have rafters every 2 or even 4 feet. This was different. This was heavy. Then, perpendicular to those main beams, he laid a grid of 6x6 joists, creating a dense, interlocking lattice of timber. It looked more like a railroad trestle than a cabin roof. Silas Croft, the mill owner, drove by one afternoon and stopped his truck. Silas was a man who had built half the cabins in the valley. He was respected. He walked over, casting a critical eye on the structure. "Arthur," he said, his voice laced with professional concern, "that's a mighty lot of wood up there. You're putting more weight in the roof than the snow you're trying to hold." Arthur just nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "It needs to be strong, Mr. Croft." "Strong for what? A normal snow load? Maybe. But a wet, heavy snow in March, the kind that snaps trees, that roof will have 20, maybe 30,000 pounds of weight on it. These short spans help, I'll grant you that. But this whole design, it's a risk." Arthur kept his voice level. "The spans are the key. A 12-foot beam can hold many times the weight of a 24-foot beam of the same size." This was the core of his shipwright's knowledge. He knew that the load-bearing capacity of a beam increases exponentially as its length decreases. By breaking the roof into a grid of tiny, short spans, he was creating a structure of immense strength, far stronger than a conventional roof with its long, vulnerable rafters. The forces were directed straight down into the load-bearing walls, not outward, as they are on a pitched roof. The narrator can add an aside here. Now here's what made this actually brilliant. He was distributing the load. Instead of the weight being concentrated on a few long rafters, it was spread evenly across dozens of interlocking points, like the difference between standing on one leg versus lying flat on the ice. He finished the lattice and then covered it with 2 layers of thick 2-inch planking. Over that, he laid down heavy tar paper, sealing the seams with hot bitumen he bought from the county road crew. The roof was now a single, monolithic, waterproof slab. Then came the strangest part, the part that turned curiosity into ridicule. He built the parapet, a low, 18-inch wall around the entire edge. To his neighbors, it looked like he was intentionally building a basin to catch and hold the very thing that could destroy him. Jed, a burly logger with a loud mouth, saw it from the road and laughed. "What in God's name is Jensen doing now, building a swimming pool for the angels?" The finished cabin looked squat, unnatural. From the outside, it looked like a fortress bunker, half buried in the earth. The flat roof and the parapet wall gave it an alien profile against the backdrop of steeply pitched A-frames that dotted the valley. The total cost was staggering in its modesty. The $75 for the surplus beams, another $50 for the planking, which he got at a discount from the mill, $10 for the tar paper and bitumen. Under $150 for a home he believed would finally keep his family warm. That evening, Elspeth stood by the doorway, looking at the finished structure. Her face was a mixture of pride in her husband's work and deep anxiety. "Arthur," she said softly, twisting a loose thread on her apron, "people are going to think we've lost our minds." She paused. "They're already calling it Jensen's Folly." Arthur looked at his work, then at her. His response was calm and final. Let them. The ridicule started before the first snow. It wasn't malicious at first. It was the kind of gentle mocking reserved for a well-liked but eccentric neighbor. But as summer turned to fall, the tone began to shift. The build was complete, and its strangeness was a permanent feature of the landscape, a constant topic of conversation. And when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw defiance. They saw a man who thought he knew better than 100 years of hard-won frontier wisdom. Silas Croft, the mill owner, felt a professional duty to intervene. He stopped by again in late October on the pretext of delivering some final trim boards. He was the valley's authority critic, a man whose opinion on building carried immense weight. He walked around the cabin, his hands on his hips, his brow furrowed. "Arthur," he began, trying to sound more concerned than judgmental, "I've been thinking about this roof of yours. It's not the weight itself that's my main worry anymore. It's the moisture." He tapped one of the log walls. "When you get 4-5 feet of snow up there, the bottom layer, pressed against the roof by the weight above and warmed by the heat from your cabin, is going to melt. You'll have a slush layer sitting up there all winter. That water will find its way into every crack. It'll rot your beams from the inside out. In 2 years, this whole structure will be spongy." It was a reasonable, technical objection from an experienced man. It was the kind of argument that sounded like pure common sense. Arthur listened patiently, then gave his usual terse response. "I'm trying something different, Silas." He offered no further defense. He didn't explain that the heavy layer of tar and bitumen was thicker and more waterproof than any roof in the county. He didn't explain that the insulative power of the dry snow on top would keep the roof surface so cold that melting would be minimal. He just let the silence hang there. Silas shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face, and left. The public mockery was crueler. A few weeks later, Arthur was at the trading post, buying flour and salt. Jed, the logger, was there, holding court with a few other men around the pot-bellied stove. He saw Arthur and raised his voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. Heard Jensen's building a coffin and putting a roof on it. Saves the undertaker some work when that thing comes down. The men laughed. Arthur didn't flinch. He paid for his goods, nodded a curt goodbye to the store owner, and walked out. But the words followed him home. The gossip network was in full swing. At the quilting circle, the women would ask Elspeth, their voices dripping with feigned concern, if she wasn't worried about all that snow. Wasn't she afraid to sleep in that house? Their pity was harder to bear than open laughter. Conversations would go quiet when she entered a room. She was the wife of the fool, an object of communal sympathy and head-shaking. Even the institutions weighed in. Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent, made an official visit. He was a man who lived by government pamphlets and agricultural bulletins. He carried a clipboard and made careful notes. "Mr. Jensen," he said, peering at the parapet wall, "I admire the workmanship. It's very solid. But this design, it's not in any manual I've ever seen. All the literature from the University Extension Service recommends a roof pitch of at least 6/12 for heavy snow regions. You're at about 1/12. It's unconventional. I have concerns about structural failure." Arthur's response was the same. "We'll see." But the cut that went deepest came from family. Elspeth's brother, Thomas, came for Sunday dinner. He was a good man, a practical farmer who wanted the best for his sister. After the children were put to bed, he spoke to Arthur, man to man. His criticism was framed as concern, which made it all the more painful. "Arthur," he said, his voice low, "I have to tell you, people are talking. They think you're being stubborn. Or worse, that you just don't know any better because you're from the old country. They're worried for Elspeth and the kids. They're going to think you're either scared of clearing a roof or you're incompetent. Maybe both." Elspeth, clearing the table, froze. Her back was to the men, but Arthur could feel her shame. This was the heart of the matter. His competence, his ability to provide and protect, was being questioned by the entire community. Arthur looked at his brother-in-law. His face remained a calm mask. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas. I'm trying to keep my family warm." By November, as the first flurries began to spin in the gray air, not one person in the valley thought Arthur Jensen had solved a problem. They thought he'd built a monument to his own foolish pride, a monument that was about to be put to the test. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Arthur right. It changed how people in that corner of the world thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1952 is still recorded in the climatology archives of Idaho as one of the most severe of the 20th century. It wasn't just a storm, it was a season-long assault. It began with the cold. December 8th, the overnight low was minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. December 12th, it was minus 31. By December 18th, the thermometer on the porch of the trading post read minus 38 degrees, with wind chills pushing past 60 below. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never once climbed above zero. Then came the snow. It wasn't a gentle powder. It was a relentless, wind-driven deluge. It started on the evening of the 20th. By morning, there were 2 feet of new snow. By the morning of the 22nd, there were 4 feet. The wind piled it into drifts that buried fences and made roads impassable. The valley was cut off, and the suffering began. The community, with their time-tested, steep-roofed cabins, was in a desperate fight. The Colby Ranch, the largest in the area, was burning through 2 cords of wood a month just to keep the main house at 42 degrees. Families were burning half a cord a week, a staggering amount, just to stay above freezing. The conventional designs were failing. The brutal cold made the wood they had cut and stacked brittle and inefficient. Some were burning green wood, which hissed and smoldered, producing more smoke than heat. The steep roofs were a curse. The wind screamed over them, sucking the life and warmth out of the houses. Snow would build up, then release in thunderous slides that blocked doors and windows, requiring hours of back-breaking shoveling in life-threatening temperatures just to get out. The Thompson family's chimney, caked with the creosote from burning unseasoned wood, caught fire. They had to put it out with snow, leaving them without heat for a full day. Down the road, the Miller family's prize bull, a creature worth more than their cabin, froze to death in its barn, a barn with a traditional roof that offered little insulation. Children were sick, huddled under every blanket their parents owned. Some families, running low on firewood, had started burning furniture. It was a state of emergency, silent and undeclared. Every family for themselves, locked in a grim battle with the cold. And then people started noticing the Jensen place, or rather, they noticed the lack of activity. There was no sign of Arthur on his roof, no desperate shoveling. There was no mountain of shed snow piled around the foundation. In fact, the cabin was disappearing. It was being slowly, peacefully buried under a thick, uniform blanket of white. The snow on the roof was level with the top of the parapet, 4 feet deep and perfectly smooth. The only sign of life was a single, thin, almost lazy wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. It wasn't the thick, panicked plume of a stove being fed constantly. It was the smoke of a slow, steady fire. A fire that was merely maintaining warmth, not fighting a losing battle against the cold. On the 22nd, a neighbor riding his horse to check on his cattle traps saw Arthur step outside his front door. The temperature was 35 below zero. The neighbor was bundled so heavily only his eyes were visible. Arthur was in his shirt sleeves. He scooped up a bucket of fresh snow to melt for water, gave a calm nod to his neighbor, and went back inside. The story spread like wildfire. Arthur Jensen, in his shirt sleeves. It didn't make sense. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It would become a local legend. The vindication began on December 23rd, the coldest day of the snap. Silas Croft was making rounds in his heavy-duty truck, checking on families he knew were in trouble. He carried a few extra loads of split, dry cordwood for emergencies. He saved the Jensen place for last. He was genuinely worried. With 4 feet of snow on that flat roof, he was sure he'd find the family huddled in a single room, the roof beams groaning, on the verge of collapse. He parked his truck, the engine groaning in the cold, and waded through the deep snow to the door. He expected to see fear. He was prepared to offer shelter at his own home. He knocked, his gloved hand making a dull thud. The door was opened by Elspeth. She wasn't wearing a coat. She wasn't wrapped in a blanket. She wore a simple wool dress. Silas was hit by a wave of warmth. It was so shocking, so utterly contrary to the brutal cold he had just left, that he physically recoiled. The warmth hit him like stepping into a different season. It was a dense, stable, quiet warmth. Not the scorching, temporary heat of an overstoked stove, but the deep, pervasive comfort of a home that was winning the war against the cold. "Silas," Elspeth said, her voice calm. "Merry Christmas. Come in. You look frozen." "Elspeth? Is everything all right?" he stammered, his eyes wide. "The roof? The weight? We're fine, Silas. We're managing fine." Her voice was steady, but it was what he saw behind her that made the world tilt on its axis. Through the cabin opening, Silas saw Anders and Ingrid. They were sitting at the kitchen table, drawing on pieces of paper. They were in cotton shirts, not coats, not sweaters, shirts, in 38 below zero weather. He stepped inside. taking off his hat. The air was warm, and more surprisingly, it was dry. There was no condensation on the windows, no frost on the interior walls. It felt impossible. Arthur came in from the back room, carrying a small load of firewood. A small load. He nodded to Silas. "Silas, cold enough for you?" he asked, a hint of a smile in his voice. Silas couldn't form a coherent sentence. He just gestured around the room. How is this possible, Arthur? What are you burning?" "The same wood as everyone else," Arthur said. "Just not as much of it. We're burning less than a cord every 3 weeks." Silas stared at him. The number was nonsensical. A cord every 3 weeks? Arthur, people are burning half a cord a week just to keep their pipes from bursting. The Colbys are going through a cord every 10 days. Arthur simply shrugged and added 2 small logs to the stove. The firebox was barely half full. Silas, the practical builder, the man who believed only in what he could measure, walked over to the wall thermometer that hung by the door. He squinted at it in the lantern light. He took off his glasses and wiped them, thinking the cold had frosted them over. He put them back on and looked again. The mercury sat clearly, undeniably, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. 68 degrees. While outside, the world was locked at -38, a temperature difference of 106 degrees. That was the impossible number. Silas walked back to the thermometer. He touched the wall around it. It was cool, but not cold. He looked up at the ceiling. The massive beams were perfectly straight. There was no sag, no groan, no sign of stress. "The snow," Silas whispered, more to himself than to Arthur. "It's the snow." "It's an insulator," Arthur said simply. 4 feet of it. Better than anything you can buy. "But the weight?" "The deck is built to hold it," Arthur said. "The load is spread evenly. It's static. Stable." Silas Croft, the most respected builder in the valley, stood in the center of Arthur Jensen's warm, quiet cabin. He looked at the comfortable children, at the calm, coatless wife, at the small, efficient fire. He compared it to the shivering families he had just visited, to the groaning roofs, to the desperate, unending consumption of fuel. He saw the irrefutable evidence of his senses. He was a proud man, but he was an honest one. He looked at Arthur, not with the eye of a critic, but with the dawning respect of a student. His conversion was terse, but total. "Arthur," he said, his voice raspy with emotion, "I've been building in this valley for 40 years. He paused, shaking his head slowly. "We've been doing it wrong." This was more than just a warm cabin. It was a redefinition of survival. The children did their schoolwork without shivering. Elspeth cooked in normal clothes. They slept soundly through the night, not waking to feed a hungry stove or to the terrifying roar of a roof avalanche. The system turned winter from something to survive into something to live through. It provided not just warmth, but dignity. The next day, Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, made it through on a snowcat, bringing emergency supplies. He too stopped at the Jensen cabin, expecting a disaster. He too was met with the same shocking wave of warmth. He carried calibrated thermometers. He measured the interior temperature at 68.5 degrees Fahrenheit, the exterior at -36 degrees Fahrenheit. He measured the surface temperature of the ceiling. It was barely cool to the touch. The snow was doing its job. Arthur, it turned out, had kept meticulous records. He had a logbook with daily entries, outside temperature, inside temperature, and the exact amount of wood burned. It wasn't luck. It was data. Abernathy copied the numbers onto his clipboard, his hand shaking slightly. The evidence was undeniable. The folly was, in fact, a masterpiece. Word spread through the valley as soon as the roads were passable. It spread not as gossip, but as news. impossible news. By the time the Great Cold Snap broke in mid-January, half the valley knew that something revolutionary was happening at the quiet Norwegian's place. The adoption didn't begin with a committee or a formal plan. It began with desperation. The first convert was a neighbor, Mark Peterson, a young farmer with 3 children. A section of his own steep roof had collapsed under a lopsided snow load, dumping tons of snow into his hayloft and killing 2 of his milk cows. He was ruined and defeated. He came to Arthur, hat in hand. "Arthur," he said, his voice cracking, "I saw your place. Silas told me. Can you show me what you did?" Arthur didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply walked Mark over to the old cabin, now his workshop, and sketched the design for the roof frame on a piece of scrap lumber. He spent the next day helping Mark source surplus beams from the mill. Silas Croft, hearing about it, sold Mark the wood at cost. By spring, Mark had built a smaller, simpler version on a new barn. The following winter, it performed just as flawlessly. That was the spark. By that summer, 7 more families were building new cabins or retrofitting old ones with the Jensen roof, as it was now being called. They didn't call it a flat roof, they called it a snow load roof. 12 more built them the following year. Within 5 years, the squat, strong profile of the snow load cabin became a common sight in the higher, snowier parts of the county. Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, became Arthur's greatest champion. He published a formal bulletin through the State Extension Service titled A Study in Static Snow Load Insulation and Framing. It was filled with Arthur's data, Abernathy's measurements, and detailed diagrams of the roof structure. It was sent to every county in the state. Variations appeared across the region. Some used steel I-beams from salvage yards, others used locally milled round logs. But the principle remained the same. Hold the snow, don't shed it. What Arthur Jensen had built in 1951 using ancient maritime engineering principles, anticipated by nearly half a century, what modern building scientists would call a super-insulated or passive house design. He had created a thermal envelope using the materials at hand. Years later, a journalist from Boise came to interview him about the famous design. He asked Arthur if he knew he was an innovator, a revolutionary. Arthur, an old man by then, just shrugged and pointed to a picture of a fishing trawler on his wall, its decks awash in a heavy sea. "The sea teaches you to work with pressure," he said, "not fight it. The principle isn't new, it's just correct." The original cabin still stands today, a testament to his work. It's owned by his granddaughter. She says it's still the warmest, quietest house in the valley when the snows come. The story of Jensen's Folly is a story about the clash between tradition and physics. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness, and it didn't reward tradition for tradition's sake. It rewarded what worked. It rewarded the quiet observer who saw a problem not as a curse, but as an opportunity. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for one proven frontier technique every week. And if this story changed how you think about a problem, give it a like. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of frontier engineering. The characters and specific names used are fictional, but the techniques are based on real historical practices and the timeless principles of physics.